Thank you. When Howard said you don't have to listen to the 90 minutes, I'm thinking everyone's going, well, why am I sitting here then if I can just go home and fast forward to the good parts, right?
Live is always better.
Live's always better. It's great to be here. Thank you. A lot of familiar faces from yesterday. So I apologize. Well, I don't apologize. I will just say some of this will be repetitive from yesterday. But if you're like me, you might hear it and say, I've heard that somewhere before, but I can't quite place it. So we'll be reviewing. Also, there are handouts on the seats next to you. If you don't have one, we can get you one. There's a table on one side which summarizes some of what I'll be going over today. I think it's just a helpful summary.
There's a second sheet that I brought that has Jeremy's bio.
Yeah,
Who did not get one of those, if you'd like that?
And then church was generous enough to and smart enough to bring books. I didn't bring books. So there are books here too if you would like to purchase a copy of the book. Otherwise you can scan it or use the URL and get it online if you
No,
would.
buy the books.
Or buy the book.
$10, yeah, or two.
Buy the book or two. Just real quickly, a little bit about who I am. I've been at Augsburg for 14 years. I teach on the religion faculty there. I oversee the ministry degree there's an undergraduate ministry degree programs, and it's been there a very long time. It used to be called the Youth and Family Ministry degree program. It's now called Theology and Public Leadership, and the purpose of the degree is to prepare equip students to go right out of college, right into the congregation and start doing leadership in ministry. Some of our students, it also functions as a pre-seminary degree for them, and so they'll move from our degree program on to seminary. So I've been doing that for 14 years. We also have a week-long event every summer for high school students on campus called the Youth Theology Institute. So high school students get to come and spend a week on campus seeing what campus life is like, studying theology. So it's theology camp at Augsburg, and it's a lot of fun. Let's see, what else do we do? We have, I also oversee our youth studies minor. So there's a degree in ministry, and then there's a minor in youth studies. And then we just started a couple of years ago a new project where we're looking at innovative ministry with young adults. So trying to get a sense of why young adults are not staying engaged in the church and how churches might re-engage them in that work. So that's been some research and some experimentation with congregations in the Twin Cities, learning with them and from them as we together try and crack that nut, I guess. So that's some of the work we've been doing, and then also recently became the executive director of a center at Augsburg called the Christensen Center for Vocation. And the Christensen Center, which is a word, I can say vocation here and assume that a lot of you will know what that word means. But essentially what we're trying to do in that center is work with congregations to help a congregation discern its communal or corporate vocation and call, right? So I was at dinner last night with some of your pastors and hearing about the park that this church has been kind of envisioning and dreaming about for a long time, and the call that is growing out of this congregation to do something meaningful in that place for the folks who live there. That's vocation. That's communal discernment, corporate discernment, where a community of people come together and wonder together, what is it God's calling us to do? Who is it God's calling us to be in this place at this time for the sake of our neighbor? And so with the Christensen Center at Augsburg, we're trying to help congregations do some of the work you've been learning how to do as well. So that's a lot of what I do, just a little bit of the background. My undergraduate degree was in child psychology at the University of Minnesota, so I always like to see if there are any Gophers in the room. All right, yeah. All right. So University of Minnesota, child psychology, and then a master's and a PhD at Luther Seminary up in St. Paul. That's me. It's nice to be here. So
You also have family here.
And I have family here, yes. My father-in-law and mother-in-law live in Fort Myers. We're in Naples for a while. And my aunt and her partner are here as well. So, and I have family up in Minnesota. I have a wife and 2 kids. I could probably talk for 90 minutes about them, but I won't. There's a lot of anxiety around young people and why they aren't at church or or whether or not they even want to be at church. And I get that anxiety. I understand why it exists. But I think any problem we want to solve, we can come at that problem from a place of anxiety. We can try and solve it because we're anxious about it, or we can try and solve it because we're compassionate about it. And our approach towards something, when we approach something out of compassion, our approach to it will be completely different than when we approach it out of anxiety. And so some of what I hope to do today is maybe lessen your anxiety about this and increase your compassion about it. I'm not trying to say you don't love your young people. I believe that you do. And so what I'm trying to say is trust that love, and don't be too anxious, because what I see in our young people is a lot of hope, where the involvement in congregations across the country has dipped, but our young people have not given up on God. They're still quite curious about it. They ask a lot of questions. They wonder quite a bit about it, and they need communities of people who will come around them in new ways, in different ways. The purpose of this talk is to not tell you what those ways are, because they're different in every place, but the purpose of this talk is to sort of liberate us from the way we've been thinking about teenagers and start imagining a new way of thinking about teenagers. So that's what we hope to do. So let's have a little fun at their expense. I like to start this way sometimes just by throwing out stereotypes. So teenagers are so, and these could be teenagers today, or these could have been things people said about you when you were a teenager. So let's just throw some of those out. Teenagers are so, what? Sullen. Moody.
Self-centered.
Self-centered. Spoiled.
Responsible.
Irresponsible. My mother-in-law's going off.
Non-communicative.
Non-communicative. Yeah. Teenagers are so lazy, inexperienced,
Tied to their phones.
tied to their phones, insecure, uneducated, cliquish,
Unwise.
unwise,
Ditzy.
mean, kids,
Ditzy.
ditzy.
Don't care if they drive or not.
They don't care if they, yeah, right. They're not a big deal anymore.
They are so wonderful.
Oh! You blew the, now you might as well just close
Oh,
up
I
shop
thought
and
you were
go
looking
home.
for that negative.
They are wonderful, and this is why I like to do this exercise, because if you take any one of those things we just said and ran it through this gauntlet, we start to realize that everything we just said is not true, right? So we'll use an example. Someone said lazy. Is laziness reserved for the teenage years? No. Then why do we call them lazy? Are adults ever lazy?
Yeah.
Then why do we talk about teenagers as being lazy? Have you experienced a young person not being lazy? Right. You get the picture, right? Anything and every single stereotype we could possibly pull out of our heads about young people is just not true. It's not factual all the time. Do they behave in these ways sometimes? Yes, absolutely. Do we? Yes, absolutely.
But historically, if you look at some of this, this is what was said in the 1600s, the 1700s,
Yeah, right.
and the 1800s
Right.
about young people.
Right.
And it's hilarious to read the historical accounts of this.
Yes, absolutely. And we can either continue to allow those stereotypes to shape our imagination around our young people, or we can find new ways to think about them, because they'll live up to our expectations no matter how low they are, right? So shifting from there, I want to start with the gospel, the good news, and a particular way of thinking about it, because we use this phrase all the time. We talk all the time about sharing the good news, right? We share the good news, we share the gospel, but what does the gospel actually do? What does good news actually do? And I love this definition by Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall. He says, gospel's good news because it engages, takes on, and does battle with bad news, offering another alternative, another vision of what could be, another way into the future. Some people get nervous when they see this definition because they say, well, where is Jesus in that? And I would say the good news is always Jesus, and Jesus shows up looks and sounds differently based on how my neighbor's experiencing bad news in that moment. The way I show up with the good news of Jesus is going to look and sound different depending on how my neighbor is experiencing suffering, fear, brokenness, anxiety, bad news in their life. Okay? So if we want to proclaim good news to our young people or to anyone, we have to first do the hard work of understanding the bad news, right? And so then the big question that I've been mulling over, and this book essentially, there's an endorsement on the back that says Jeremy Paul Myers has offered us a timely and engaging little book. There's a friend of mine who endorsed the book, and he called it a little book. And so I told him, if next time you write a book, let me endorse it, and I'll say, Andy Root has written the same book for a 7th time. But this little book is like 2 decades of me trying to think differently about young people. And the question I was sort of pondering, I've been pondering and wondering is, what if the primary way our young people are experiencing bondage, brokenness, fear, suffering, or bad news in their life? What if the primary source of bad news in their life is this caricature we've projected on them called the adolescent, the teenager? These assumptions that we make about them, right? All teenagers are always this way, therefore you must be just another one of those, right? And we think that when we see them walking down the street, in the middle of the street. We think about that when they're loud at the restaurants, right? All of those things go through our head. Oh, teenagers today, teens today, right? And so what if the primary way our young people are in bondage is through this thing we project on them that we call the adolescent, right? So adolescence as a life stage is relatively new. It's not even really 100 years old yet. And I want to unpack some of that history today with you. But I want to talk somewhat about the context that we're in where this is happening, because I think this is important. There's a philosopher, Charles Taylor, who wrote a really interesting book about a decade ago called The Secular Age. And in that book, he's talking about kind of the relationship between faith and public life, or the sacred and the secular, if you will. And I find it really interesting because he would say we're in a stage called third secularity. And I think that what I see churches doing is trying to solve problems as if they're still in second secularity. And I think this applies to the conversation we're having today about young people. So I just want to quickly try and describe these 3 eras. The first era, the first secularity, would be when society, and this would have been pre-Enlightenment, right? So a long time ago, though there probably still are people who function in a first secularity, but first secularity as a societal-wide phenomenon was a long time ago. But at that time, pre-Enlightenment, society believed collectively that there were sacred spaces and that there were secular spaces, and that the sacred spaces were managed and occupied by religious professionals, right? And then the rest of us spent most of our days in secular spaces. We were sacred people, but we spent our lives in secular spaces. And the purpose of the church at that time was to maintain a sacred space, a respite, a lifeboat, where people from the secular spaces could come once a week and hose off all the grime from the secular world and douse themselves in sacredness, and then go out, and hopefully that will last for a week until they come back and do it again, right? That was sort of the way we thought about sacred and secular. Separate spaces, but most people were religious, and these religious people lived their lives in secular places and would come and get their daily dose of sacredness. With the Enlightenment and the emerging of the scientific method, people became really suspicious of religion. And so what started to happen was it was no longer about sacred spaces and secular spaces. Now it was about sacred people and secular people. So many people were like squelching or toning down their religious lives because it wasn't seen as very legitimate anymore, right? And so they were embarrassed by it, and so they toned it down. And it wasn't about religious people living in secular spaces and coming to sacred spaces. Now it was it was people choosing to be themselves sacred or secular, all right? So it shifted from spaces to people. People would say, I'm a sacred person, I'm a Christian, I'm a religious person, or no, I don't want to associate with that, all right? So then the church thinks at that time their role is to convince or entice secular people to become sacred again. We have to attract them back, right? That's second secularity. We have to convince them that they really want to be sacred people again. And this also fuels sort of the creation of sacred versions of secular realities, right? So this is where contemporary Christian music comes from, right? Why should the devil have all the good music, right? Like, we need Christian versions of everything. That comes out of second secularity. Charles Taylor would say, now we're actually in third secularity. And third secularity would say that all spaces and all people are always both sacred and secular, right? All spaces and all people are always both sacred and secular. So a young person who chooses not to come to church on Sunday mornings because they would rather practice their religion, their spirituality at their yoga studio, is going to do that, right? And they don't see that they don't see themselves as a secular person hanging out in secular places. They see themselves as a sacred and secular person doing sacred and secular things. And so we would be thinking in the church, oh, but what happens at the church is so much more important than what happens at the yoga studio. What happens here is so much more transformative than what happens at the yoga studio. But that person's framework is like, great, if that works for you, your space in that church is no more sacred and no more secular than my space here at the yoga studio. That's kind of how society thinks now. They're not necessarily anti-religious. They're just recognizing that we don't have a corner on the market of sacredness. The church doesn't have a corner on the market of sacredness. So the task of the church now is not to attract people. The task of the church now is to go where people are and become a dialogue partner with them in making meaning. So we're no longer trying to compete with the yoga studio, and I'm just using that as one example. We no longer have to compete with the yoga studio to get people to show up. Now we become a dialogue partner with the yoga studio, learning from them and talking with them about how transformation happens in people's lives. And we get to be a conversation partner at the table with them. And if we abandon those places, then we're abandoning the places where our young people are making meaning in their lives. If we keep staying here, hoping they'll show up, then they're not leaving us, we're actually leaving them, right? Because we've abandoned the places where they're showing up and trying to live their lives and trying to make meaning. So the church, we keep thinking that they're customers, they're potential customers, potential clients, and we have to entice them to our brand more than the yoga studio brand, and that's not the way they're thinking about it. So it's not a competition. So what happens is, and what might be going through some of your minds when you walked in today is, what can the church do to attract our young people back to church? Maybe Jeremy will tell us what we can do to get them to come back. And that's a second secularity question. The real question is, how can we show up where they live their lives and help them understand how God's working in their life there in that place? That's a different strategy than what we would come up if we're asking this question, right?
It's a different paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oftentimes, you hear people say, you really need to, or you really ought to, or
I hear that all the time.
Instead of saying an invitation,
Yeah.
because to me an invitation is so much better, and it's not crusty, and it's not it's an invitation. But then of course part two is explaining part two.
Absolutely.
But the invitation, I don't care what it is, if you think about it, the invitation is so much better than you really need to, or you really ought to.
And they're far more interested, and I say they, and I mean probably anyone, not just young people, but anyone would be far more interested in hearing why this place and these practices are important for you and how you live out your faith than hearing you tell them why you think this should be important for them. They would love, love, love to hear you talk about why this community is important to you, right? Yes?
First of all, I'm trying to control myself that I'm sitting in a church with church people hearing this. And so that's very exciting to me.
Great.
The problem that I've experienced 30 years working with young people is that people in the church are so fragmented that when they go to the yoga studio, they're out of their orbit.
Yeah, right.
And their whole communication
Yeah,
is gone.
yeah, yeah.
And so, I served at a Baptist church years ago, and the deacons went out and told the kids shooting hoops on a Wednesday night that you can't shoot hoops unless you come to Bible study.
Wow.
Well, needless to say, I left that church.
Mhm.
So the week that I was here 2 weeks ago, they talked about fragmentation.
Yeah.
Our fragmentation as people of faith.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that you'll get to the how do we
Mhm.
do that.
How do we do this? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I was just bringing attention, you're using the word young people.
Yeah.
I have, a 10-year-old that I refer to a young person. He's within his home, his house, his parents' control. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that higher end of young people, that age where they begin to leave the house, why are they not coming back, college, and of course, like you said yesterday, a lot of young adults are not getting married until much later, so I just felt like that was
To distinguish
referring
between
that was referring to independent young people.
Yeah, I think what I was just talking about here was probably more around young adults, 20-somethings, but the rest of the talk will really be more about younger than that. Yeah. So when I say young people, I mean children, preteens, teens. I don't like to say adolescents. And I don't like to say kids because kid's actually a goat. It's not a person. Yeah.
Jeremy, building on Myron and Audrey's perspective here, it sounds like, and help me with this one, because I think it's important, at least for my brain. The first secularity is where we did a lot of preaching to. The second secularity sounds like still preaching to and sell to. The third secularity sounds, as Myron said, an invitation, but that means asking more questions, interchanging, collaborating with, being a partner with, co-creating with. That is such it's like, I can see the first secularity moving into the second secularity. The third secularity, you've almost got to draw a big black line between those, because that's a real shift in thinking and a shift in acting.
Yeah.
And not something that they're training in seminaries.
Yeah, right. No, I think, and this is, to go back to the Douglas John Hall quote about gospel, in order to proclaim, you were saying preaching too, in order to proclaim good news, you have to first hear the bad news. So rather than me assuming, and I'm not anti-yoga by any means, I keep using this example, but did you just finish your class? Yeah. As I'm sitting here going, man, I probably should have done a little bit this morning, but rather than me assuming that they somehow don't have, like, that for someone who is completely out of touch with their body and hates their body, and is trying to rediscover their body and love their body, yoga might actually really be more powerful good news for them right now than Christian community. Absolutely. Right? And so how do we come along? So it's not a competition, so how do we come alongside that person and hear their story and then say, the things I hear you saying about yoga happen for me also when I take Holy Communion. And that's how I come to love my body and know my body and understand my part of the body, right? So it doesn't have to be this competition. It can be, we can start with the assumption that everyone is longing for life and good news, and we can start with the assumption, and we believe God is the source of that. And so if that's happening in the yoga studio, we can believe that God is somehow doing that work in the yoga studio. And we can allow them to have their interpretation of it, and we can have our interpretation of it. But it's not to convince them to come to our side. It's to be a dialogue partner. Yeah, I saw some hands pop up. Yeah.
My name is Pastor Jose. I am one of the associate pastors here and multicultural ministry. But yesterday, what happens, and what you said today about the third secularity opens a really brilliant light to me. Because when I was about telling the announcements, I was kind of, okay, Wednesday, youth are gonna meet, and then vineyard? Is that right? We are supposed to meet here at church. And then they correct me and they say, well, Pastor, no, this Wednesday we're gonna meet at Vineyard. Vineyard is an outdoor campus with football, soccer, and basketball teams.
Sure.
But now, wow, what you offer, at least for me as a pastor, I say, this is totally right. Because that place is sacred and secular at the same time. When the secular and sacred people meet, and that is what we should be doing.
Right.
Yeah, meeting where the people met.
And it
Right,
does,
and you-
yeah, and it doesn't mean we don't have something unique to say. You know, it means that we can't sit here and expect people to show up anymore. We have to, like, if the good news is really good, then we need to hear the bad news and be in the places where people are trying to sort that out in their own lives. So I wanted this is the context we're in, and the questions we ask about our young people and their relationship to our congregations will change when we realize that we're in a different paradigm, a different era. Okay? Yes, sir.
And perhaps consistent with that, over the years being active in the church, 20, 30 years ago, a young person would get confirmed, and they'd leave the church. Then they got married, and then they'd return with their children. And you don't see that happening as much today. And a question I have is, and further, with some of the young people I know, they even question the faith. They're questioning, the whole thing, unlike before. And I'm wondering, with the troubles that we face with the clergy in the Catholic Church, the accusations, is all that blending into this whole thing for not only the youth, but a broader segment stepping back?
Yeah. Oh, I heard so many things in that question that I want to respond to. First, the clergy abuse is a major turnoff, and there are people who have left all denominations, not just the Catholic Church, because of that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It also feeds into some frustrations and assumptions that were already there, right? So there was already people were already growing skeptical of churches and organized religion and their power and their unwillingness to share power or their abuse of power. And so then when that scandal hit, it just reaffirmed some of the things people were already starting to assume. And I put the responsibility back on the church for why are young people leaving. Why don't young people come back after confirmation, or why aren't they coming back once they get married or having kids? Some of that is because they're not getting married, and some of that is because they're not having kids, and a lot of it is because we never, and I'm taking the blame for this. It's the church's fault. We didn't do anything with them to show them that this community was a vital part of their life. And Lutherans have no other denomination has what we have with confirmation. Like, if you look at the numbers of young people active in all the denominations, you will see, like, 7th and 8th grade, 9th grade, this spike in the Lutheran churches, the Lutheran denominations, this massive spike. We have a captive audience, and we haven't done our work with them in a way that's made them feel like they need to stick around, right? So I kind of want us to own that. And I also, the other thing I'll say is, I also want us to, and this is not meant as an insult to you, I want this to be inspirational, not critical. I want us to get to a place where we, as a church, are more concerned about childhood poverty rates than post-confirmation retention rates. And if as a church we can be more concerned about childhood poverty rates, and if we're actually engaged in that, then my hunch is post-confirmation retention rates will solve themselves. right? But if we're only worried about post-confirmation retention rates, and if we're only working on that, we might not move the needle, and there'll still be kids waking up every day in poverty.
It's the wrong measure.
Yeah.
My last point, and
Sure.
to your last point.
Yeah.
In our church, inspired by this church, we have an off-campus ministry with a Lutheran church in Hartford, Connecticut, in the poorest section.
Sure.
And what you find, if you can engage not just older people, but younger people in that endeavor, they identify with that, and they're more active.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yep. Our younger people want to live public lives,
Exactly.
and they want to know how faith empowers and frames that public life. And if we don't do that with them, none of this matters to them, and they'll go somewhere else that will help them figure that out. Yeah.
I'm completely agree in relationship to the sort of the way third secularity, but what I'm feeling is a sense of missing is that there is a third secularity native narrative.
Okay.
And from my impression is if we think that getting to childhood poverty will actually get us to Christianity, I think we come into that narrative and we'll get stuck in that narrative, and there will not, no one will see that there's a difference between our narrative and the narrative that's common.
Yeah.
That this isn't a passive, just it happens and it's just a different place to be.
Yeah.
There's another narrative that's dominating what's going on.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I'm glad you say that, because I wouldn't say, just to use your words, I wouldn't say that working on childhood poverty will get us to Christianity. What I mean is that we need to talk about our Christianity as something that moves us towards childhood poverty. That's essentially, so it's not learn your faith and then maybe we'll do something about it, but this is vocation. We're doing this work on childhood poverty because of our Christianity, because of our faith.
I'm just struck by Christ's thing about there will always be the poor.
Yep.
Because I've got something else I'm talking about here that is universal and is not about sort of social governance, but has a different impact.
Yeah, and I think we're called to live in both of those realities at the same time, that this universal, eternal hope and belief in Christ, and simultaneously this reality of a broken social governance system where people's lives are suffering, and we need to do something in those places, not just as secular citizens, but as sacred secular citizens who believe that somehow this work is connected to the kingdom of God also. Yeah.
Sure.
But I hear what you're saying, that we can't just, it's not this anonymous Christianity where we just hide it and try to be good people. That's not what I'm proposing. So, yes.
Jeremy, one of the things I've gotten out of some of this conversation, it's what you measure. If you're measuring simply post-confirmation retention, that's what you'll aim at, and you'll do only things for that. But I think what this conversation is saying is we've got to rethink the metrics. If we're going to rethink the strategy, we have to rethink the metrics. But in the larger picture, Christianity has to be the solution to problems. And what's happening is the linkage between Christianity as a belief system and Christianity as an action system that solves problems. That linkage is broken in the minds of many people. And if we don't see ourselves as problem solvers, and just preachers, we can't get into that third paradigm.
Yeah.
Well, I think more accurate, there is no linkage, if we want to be really honest about it. The word relevance and authenticity comes to mind. And also, what is the goal? Why aren't young people in church? Because it's not relevant to their lives. If we look at Jesus met people where they were, and he engaged them in conversation. So what has meaning for me does not necessarily have meaning for a young person. So if our goal is to lead everybody to Christ so that they won't go to hell when they die, then I don't think we're going to ever achieve that goal. If our goal is to be a witness, to let our light shine, and to be in relationship wherever we are, then that's very different, I think. Because, young people are they're very sensitive, and they can spot a phony, a mile away, and they don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
My son threw the Bible at me when he was like 13 years old, and he goes, "Don't tell me what's in that, tell me what you said." Tell me what you say. You know, and that's the thing about it. It's we need to stop talking about Job and Paul and all of those people and allow our light.
Yeah.
What is Christ doing and what are the miracles that are happening today in our lives?
Yeah.
Also, I think you mentioned the confirmation or those sub-dates, the kids peak, you know, and then after. But I don't know, there must be, but support groups for younger people. I'm talking about, we have all kinds of support groups in the church, here and other places. But a thought would be a support group for those people, younger people, but again, making, and the word prayer. To me, prayer is so important for everything, and I think when you pray with somebody else, that ding, ding, ding rings a bell. It truly does. And again, use common sense, which isn't so common anymore. But that to me is important. Support groups of all kinds. And I know up north in church, we had a men's prayer group, just a men's prayer group. There were probably 20 that attended every Monday night between 7 and 8, and it was intercessory prayer primarily, praying for others, but it was you know, but the problem's starting. How do you get things started?
And
it's
that's
invitation.
Right. Well, it's invitation. And people don't have. I mean, do people want to pray with other people? Yes, absolutely. Will they show up weekly at church for an hour to do that? Quite possibly not. And so then that doesn't mean they don't want to pray, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't pray with them. That means we're going to have to find other ways to do it possibly.
And isn't a big part of that whole comment to young people define prayer?
Well,
You bring up yoga. I'm a big yoga person. It's a very spiritual experience. It can be very prayerful in its own way. So how do you define prayer with a young person?
well, and
Maybe the way they pray is totally different than learning all the words to Our Father.
Yeah.
Saying it with a group of people.
yeah. I mean, one of the best tricks I learned in youth ministry was to pretend you're dumb, and that's not too hard for me to do. And but it's like, oh, I don't know how to play this video game, or I don't know how to do this thing. Can you teach me how to do this thing, right? Yeah, and so I love the thought of like an intergenerational prayer group where it's like, teach me how you pray, and then I'm going to teach you how I pray. You know, and we can actually really pray together. But let me keep.
We had one.
Oh yeah, yep. Sorry.
You know, I think you're right about people going to confirmation and dropping off. You'll say that you'll keep those people in the congregation if you're doing social justice stuff.
Right.
The problem is that's many of those people that have dropped out of confirmation are now 40. And they have kids that are 13 or 14, and the adults are now atheists. Can you just talk to their kids about God, or do you respect the parents' beliefs?
Yeah,
And
I would say.
I can meet them at the yoga studio, but I don't think I can discuss Christ.
Yeah, that's going to be person to person, and again, what my 14 years of teaching at Augsburg, and the student body is not very Lutheran there. It's a quite diverse student body, and even the atheists want to talk about this stuff, and they're not offended. Now some would be, but they're not offended by someone who has beliefs. That they don't feel that it's a competitive marketplace. They feel like it's a place to have dialogue and that's what they're really longing for, is dialogue and conversation. So. Yeah, I think it's person to person, it really is. And so it's the hard work. What Douglas John Hall is basically saying is, you can't speak good news into someone's life until you know that person, And so it starts really just by building that relationship.
So if this family was Jewish, you wouldn't be going to them and talking to them about Jesus.
Probably not. Or you would in a different sort of way. I mean, I have Jewish friends who I talk to about Jesus all the time, but in a different way than. Yeah, there's no one size fits all strategy.
Well, it's just when you're discussing adolescence and the person's like 13 to 15. Well, how much are you allowed to address to them that's against the beliefs of their parents?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's different for every person and different for every family, and so it has to happen in this relational sort of contract. I'm going to keep moving. I had no idea this was like supposed to be just a little 2-minute.
Jeremy, this is Emmanuel Church.
Yeah.
This is us.
It's just like my classes. I come in with, yeah. So now I want to get to what I'm actually here to talk about. In this context of third secularity, we have, there's a dominant way of thinking about our young people that I'm going to call the undeveloped consumer. And what I'm going to do is quickly go through the 4 characteristics that I think frame how we think about young people right now. And so the adolescent, this caricature that exists out there, this not real, false thing that we think all of our teenagers, this false box we think all of our teenagers fit into, I call the undeveloped consumer. Let me describe that, and then I'm going to give you a little history of where that came from. And then we'll offer an alternative. And the alternative, rather than thinking about our young people as undeveloped consumers, we need to shift and begin thinking about them as called co-creators. And hopefully you'll be as interested in this as you were in Charles Taylor's second. So the first characteristic, the first thing we assume about our young people is that they're undeveloped. And developmental psychology is the source of this. I have a background in child psychology. I agree with developmental theory. Absolutely, we are all developing in our life, either forwards or backwards. And every day we're fluid and dynamic constantly. Every person at every stage of life is changing and growing and evolving. If we think about our young people as undeveloped, what we're saying is that you're not yet fully human. You haven't yet fully arrived. You can't quite yet fully contribute because you're 12, because you're 13. Because your brain, I hear this all the time. I hear this all the time in youth ministry circles. Well, their brains aren't fully developed until they're 25, and they use that as an explanation for why they made a bad decision, right? I'm like, well, I know some 50-year-olds who make some pretty bad decisions too, right? But I hear that. I hear people who are paid to be advocates and allies for young people saying that all the time. Is it true that the brain is not fully wired before they're 25? Yes. Does that mean they can't make good decisions? No. If I went to our stereotypes, right? The brain is there's this thing called plasticity. Your brain is even past 25, your brain can still learn new neural pathways, right? So the brain is constantly changing, but yet somehow we think that in the teenage years they're somehow undeveloped, and that's problematic. What the message we send to them is, you have nothing to offer yet until you fully arrive. And then they wonder, well, when is that? Because at one point, and we'll look at the history, at one point I was an adult as soon as I was strong enough to work, right, or bear children. And then all of a sudden I was an adult when I could drive, and then I was an adult when I could vote, and then I was an adult when I could buy alcohol, and then I was an adult when I got my first job. But now that doesn't happen until I'm 30, right? Or I'm not an adult until I get married, or I'm not an adult until I have kids. And that marker of adulthood just keeps getting further and further and further away from them. And so now we're essentially saying, well, even if you're 28, you haven't yet fully arrived. And that sends a message to them that, okay, I guess my role is to just stay in my parents' basement and play video games, because that's what they expect of me. Right? So that's problematic. That's one assumption we make about our young people. Another assumption is that they're identity-less. And again, I'm sorry if this is repetitive for people who were here yesterday, but Erik Erikson is a developmental theorist who talked about identity formation. He talks about crises, and that we have to resolve a crisis at every stage of life before we can move on to the next stage of life. If you don't constructively resolve a crisis, you can't move on to the next stage of life. You'll be kind of trapped in that previous stage. And so he said the crisis during adolescence is the crisis of identity. You have to know who you are before you can, in a healthy way, move out of adolescence. And So then a lot of the literature on identity really makes identity sound like this quest, this thing you have to go looking for, this thing you have to build, this thing you have to construct. It's an external thing. It's outside of you. You have to go find it. Is it under here? Is it over here? Or you have to somehow construct it and make it yourself. As Christian community, we would say identity is actually a gift given to you, right? That God choosing you and coming into a relationship with you is the primary marker of your identity. Now the pressure's off you. And I have seen this message. I have a young woman, and I tell this story in my book, a young woman who was just a little pistol in my youth ministry in Valparaiso, Indiana. She's in Sarasota, I think now. She's down here, and was the president of her congregation. But man, but she was a great leader in our youth ministry. She was a high school student when I was working there. She was a great leader, and I loved her. Funny, witty, inappropriate as all get out. And she said, "I love my Sunday night me." That's what she would tell me. I love who I am on Sunday nights when I'm at church, when I'm a small group leader. I love who I am here. And then I hate the Monday morning me. She was a bully at school. She had no patience for anyone. She kind of had a bad reputation at school for being snotty, kind of a bully, sort of. And she knew that, and she didn't like that, right? And so my mantra, her name's Erin, my mantra with Erin was like, Erin, just become who you already are. You're already the Sunday night. That's who you are. You're already this person, right? And you're the Monday morning you too. You're both of those things. But trust the Sunday night. Like, become who you already are. And that's what we get to tell young people. Identity is not this quest. It's not this hidden egg you have to go find. It's this gift that's been given to you, and the church community is there to remind people of it.
Before you slip past that,
Mm-hmm.
If you look historically back at the role of church and education, the development of moral character was always a top dead center issue for both churches and for educational systems up through probably the late 50s. That moral character development, at least from my perspective, helped develop identity, because I knew who I was and I could trust myself because I knew what that character was. That moral character development has dropped out of the church and out of education simultaneously in the last 60 years. Any thoughts about that and what that has to do with identity?
Yeah, well, I'll try and do this real quick, but it's sort of like the first, second, third secularity in a sense that there was a time when people did not question authority. Like, authority was the source of truth, and authority therefore was also the source of identity. And authority could be the church, authority could be the king, authority could be social structures, a caste system, but there was something that dictated truth and identity for you. Again, Enlightenment made people suspicious of authority, and so we shifted from trusting authority to trusting human reason, right? So now all of a sudden I can become anything I want to become, no matter what the king says, no matter what the church says, no matter what the social structures say. I don't need to trust those things. I can trust myself. So what I'm talking about is pre-modern, modern, and then postmodern people would be postmodern people would be people who don't trust authority and don't trust themselves either, and they're trying to figure out who to trust now. And my hopefulness around postmodern people is, if you don't trust authority and you don't trust yourselves, what I see them trying to trust, and the young people I've been teaching for 14 years, these are postmodern people, what I see them trying to trust is relationality. They're trying to trust the space between you and I. So you might not possess truth. You might not be able to tell me what my truth is. You might not possess truth, and I don't think I possess truth. But maybe if we talk with one another, maybe somewhere in here truth might happen, right? And I don't think they're giving up on the potential for truth or identity. I just think they don't think anyone can claim it. And so my hope is that postmodern people are trusting relationality more than authority or the self. And that's really hopeful for me.
And I like the way you place that, but suppose you have no integrity yourself. How can you trust
That would be me
relationships with no
sometimes.
integrity?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The formula doesn't work. No integrity,
Yeah.
how do I trust a relationship?
That I don't know. Yeah.
I'd argue the moral authority is tighter than I've ever seen in my life. That you can it's comes from a different source. This is my counter narrative, but that if you say the wrong thing, Professor, it's Augsburg, you can get fired,
Yeah.
or you can lose your social association.
That's why we need tenure.
What's that?
Keep going, though. Keep going.
If you say the wrong thing, you are shunned in a way that used to happen in small towns, maybe because you violated Christian mores. It's just we flip the moral authority because there's a different narrative we're moving towards. But the moral authority is tighter than I've ever seen in my life.
It's fascinating. It's like a
Depends on which
dichotomy,
side
isn't
you're
it?
on.
Yeah, right.
It's just a
Yeah.
different narrative.
I think it's
Yeah.
more
I
like.
really love what you're saying. It's really touching me at a deep level. Just to bring a little bit of quantum physics in here, it says.
Sure, why not?
It says that the intention of the observer has the ability to change that which is being observed. And if we really engage what you're saying, if our perception of young people changes, so that when we enter into relationship with them, that what we see is conveyed to them that they are in fact a child of God. That's huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's huge.
Yeah. And as I sit here and watch you speak to me and look at me, I become less anxious.
Yeah.
So what was the thing you said at the beginning? The first phrase you said. Yeah.
Quantum physics?
Yeah, but you said
No, I
what you
said
pay
I love what
attention
you're
to.
saying.
I know, but you said what you pay attention to, you can.
Okay, the quantum physics says that the intention of the observer,
The attention of the
the
observer.
intention that I have observing
Yeah.
has an impact of changing that which is being observed.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where we start when we're dealing with anyone.
And and what I'm trying to say is, to me, right now, you seem like a very unanxious person, and you're making me up here in front of this audience less anxious. And so I think this is quantum physics. Yeah. The third assumption we make about young people is that they're self-centered, that they think that they want the world to revolve around themselves. Again, going to developmental psychology, there's this idea of egocentrism. Egocentrism tells us, we often think that what egocentrism is saying is that kids don't care about other people. They only care about themselves. But what it's actually telling us is that for the first time in their lives, they can take another person's perspective, right? So the brain, when they emerge into adolescence, the brain for the first time can take you, I can for the first time in my life recognize that you have a different opinion of me than I have of myself. So when we say, what the science has told us is that young people are egocentric, and that's true. But what it means to be egocentric is that I recognize you all think differently about me. That it doesn't mean I want to be the center of the universe. It means that at any point in time, everyone in this room could turn and stare at me and have a different opinion of me. And that scares the bejesus out of me, right? and it's too much information. So they haven't learned how to filter it. It doesn't mean that they don't, it doesn't mean that they're, so it doesn't mean that they're self-centered. It means that they're actually very in tune with relationships. They're very aware of other people and who's looking at them and how they're looking at them. They're very attentive to relationship. But we think about them as being self-centered. The fourth characteristic of the undeveloped consumer is that they're consumers. This assumption that the primary role they're supposed to play in society is that of consumer. Buy, 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 buy. Convince mom, dad to buy. Convince nanny or papa to buy. Right? The only way our young people feel they have any power in society is by how they get to spend their money. And so the only way they get to express themselves or have any kind of agency in this world is through the things they buy, through the things they choose to wear, the logos, the brands they wear, through the gadgets they have. Those are the only ways we've allowed them to express themselves and have any power, is as consumers. That's a really frustrating way when you don't have a lot of money. And Henry Giroux is an educational theorist who talks about some of this stuff, and he says that the young people who can't consume or won't consume, either because they're living in poverty or because they just want to be countercultural, then become considered disposable. So our young people living in poverty who can't participate in this way, they now have no agency whatsoever. And so then they're considered disposable because they can't participate in society the way society's been structured. So these are the four characteristics that I use to kind of describe the undeveloped consumer. And again, this is essentially not true, right? This is not true in that our young people. If I were to ask you if these words described a young person in your life you care about, you would probably say no, absolutely not. Or you might say, well, sometimes, but not completely, right? So if the undeveloped consumer is the most powerful narrative, I would say, right now in society about how we think about young people, and it shapes our practices with young people. It shapes the way we do education. It shapes the way we do youth sports. It shapes the way our churches do ministry with young people, because we think when we say, well, what do our young people want? We start thinking about them as a target market, as a niche market, and we start thinking about these words as things that describe them. So now how do we create programming that people like this would want? And if we're creating programming for people like this, and the people who are trapped in this box want to be liberated from this box, they're not going to want to come to our programming, right? Because they show up and it's just reinforcing. It's not liberating them. It's not good news. It's not gospel. They're not hearing hope. They're not hearing a new way forward. They're hearing the same old, right? And so if we're going to become relevant in the lives of our young people, it means we have to understand their bad news so we can proclaim Jesus to them in a way that will sound like good news. And if this is their bad news, and I think this is their bad news, and you can layer other things on top of this. You can layer poverty on here, right? So if this is their bad news and they're living in poverty, it exacerbates it. It makes it even worse. If this is their bad news and they have a learning disability, it exacerbates it. It makes it worse, right? So if that's their bad news, then how then do we start proclaiming it? And how did we get here? That's what I want to do now. I want to, because I find this super interesting. And I mentioned this yesterday. Some of you in the room might be the first wave of teenagers in America, and so I like to do this history. So let me quickly tell you where the undeveloped consumer came from, because we didn't just wake up one morning and decide to think about our young people this way. It came from somewhere. And there are four, I don't have a thing with fours, but there are four, I think, really big cultural shifts that created the framework that grew youth culture. Okay, so I was saying this yesterday. The first wave of teenage culture in America would have been the Bobby Soxers. Are there anyone here who would consider themselves? Are there Bobby Soxers?
Watch the movies.
Yeah. Like that would have been the first.
Cary Grant was in a movie called The Bobby Soxers.
All right. So that would have been the first wave of teenage culture in America. Prior to that, people in the teenage years, like you were either you were a child and then you were an adult. And then all of a sudden you were a child or a teenager, and a child and then a teenager and then an adult. And now you're a child and then you're a teenager and then you're in this new phase that they call emerging adulthood, and then you're an adult. So adulthood keeps getting further and further away from people, right? So I want to explain how that happened. So there are 4 cultural kind of realities. One is this idea called moratorium, and then there's a set of cultural anxieties that were present in America in the early 1900s, and then the Great Depression, and then the high school. These 4 things sort of combine to create the perfect storm that generated youth culture. So let me dive into this. G. Stanley Hall, in 1904, wrote a book called Adolescence. He was the first child psychologist. All right. So in 1904, this psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, writes a book called Adolescence. And in that book, he's making the argument. And G. Stanley Hall is deeply concerned with child labor. And he doesn't want children to be working anymore. He sees, G. Stanley Hall sees our young people as being full of potential, and they will not reach adulthood with all of that potential. They will not reach adulthood as their fully creative, contributing selves if they have too many challenges on the way to becoming adults. So G. Stanley Hall sees them as a mountain stream, right? From the glacier to the valley below. We should not impede the movement of that mountain stream. Their creative juices, their energy should just be allowed to flow, right? Let them just be wild and creative. Don't put unnecessary expectations in their way. Just let them live their lives. That's G. Stanley Hall's argument. So he's asking for what he called a moratorium. There has to be a break where our young people don't have any adult-like responsibilities, when they can just sow their wild oats and be crazy, and then they'll get to adulthood fully creative and fully ready to contribute to society. All right? This was G. Stanley Hall's theory, based on absolutely no science whatsoever. and everyone latched onto it. So this was the creation of adolescence, right? There was childhood and there was adulthood. Now there's childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, because he had the perfect theory at the perfect time with no evidence whatsoever behind it. And because there was a growing anxiety around child labor. And so people were trying to find a way to justify moving children out of the workforce because they were concerned for their well-being, right? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Also, so that's the moratorium. We need to bracket the teenage years so that they can arrive to adulthood fully formed, okay? That was the first wedge between young people and adults. Third, there were massive cultural anxieties in America in the early 20th century. First one, race relations. How will folks who have been enslaved and descendants of the slaves, how will they have power in this? Who will have power in this country? How will the different races relate to one another? This was a massive source of anxiety, a massive problem that America was trying to solve. And with immigration, how will people of different races relate to one another? Second, gender roles, the flapper. All of a sudden, women had money, and women were experiencing a little more independence and able to express themselves. How will the races relate to one another? How will the genders relate to one another? Third, how will the nations relate to one another? America was also trying to become a global power, a world power. So these were 3 massive anxieties that people in our country, it was the air we breathed for decades. Without maybe even knowing it or being critical of it, it was just, there was anxiety in our bones around race, around gender, and around nation building. Now, if you think about it, this is kind of handy because we just bracketed out a period of life, which we call adolescence. The other thing that's going on at this time is the Industrial Revolution, right? And so you think about a factory, you put something in on this end of the factory, and it comes out this end of the factory something different, right? You put in a bunch of parts over here. I'm oversimplifying this. I'm a theologian. I'm not an engineer, right? It probably is more to it than this. But I think what you do is you put a bunch of parts in over here, and it comes out a car over here, right?
Simply put.
Something like that. I don't know. And so we kind of started to think about humans that way also. We bracketed out adolescence, and that became a factory. It became a technology, right? And if we put a bunch of parts in over here, by the time they come out the other side, they'll be fully formed humans. And while they're in that factory, they'll be, we in this bracketed period of life, we can solve the race problem, we can solve the gender problem, we can solve the nation building problem. So this is when scouting happens, like the YMCA happens, because there's a lot of, remember I said we can respond out of anxiety or compassion? There's a lot of anxiety about the future of our country and the stability of our country. And we start to think that this new bracketed phase of life is the place where we can solve it as a country. We put all that pressure on our young people, right? Yeah.
Jeremy, and it may be attached to a nation building, but I think there's one other major issue that shows up here in society, but doesn't get talked about, but it's acted upon, and that is the nature of what happened with what they call the Great War. Okay, we didn't know it as the First World War, we knew it as the Great War, and it cracked a hole inside the ideals of the Enlightenment, that people would be rational,
Yeah, right.
that people could constantly progress, and that war and the post-traumatic stress disorder, when you read what happened in the trench warfare to people of that era that are now trying to function in the 1920s, it is catastrophic to understanding, that, or believing that man and Christianity and YMCAs and Boy Scouts and things like that were put in place to try to counteract that tremendous anxiety, which then you couldn't drown in booze because they had prohibition at the time. And so there's a tension in there that I don't think gets recognized.
Well, yeah, and I mean the shift, when I was talking about the shift from modern, pre-modern, postmodern, the thing that kind of rang the doorbell of postmodernity was the First World War. All of a sudden people said, oh, humans aren't always rational. Oh, science can kill people. Right? And then all of a sudden they became critical of what they thought of. They became critical of unbridled progress. Right? I'm going to keep moving here. The third massive cultural change that happened is the Great Depression. And now we kind of get back to child labor as well. And this you can't see the bottom of it, but this is a poster for the National Child Labor Committee, which was formed in 1904. You recognize that year? What year? What else happened in that year that I talked about? Yeah. G. Stanley Hall's book is published, right? G. Stanley Hall's calling for a moratorium. The National Child Labor Committee is formed in 1904, and their goal is to remove young people from the workforce for the well-being of our children. They don't want children dying in the textile mills anymore. Pretty good goal, right? Here's where it becomes, and this is one of their posters. You can see G. Stanley Hall's thinking here. 2 million child workers under 16 today. We want them to be normal men and women, right? The assumption is that if they work, they won't be normal, right? And here's what's problematic. It took the Great Depression for this group to finally get child labor laws passed. It was the Fair Labor Standards Act, that Fair Labor Standards Act, was passed in 1938. So it took them 34 years to pass that, and it took the Great Depression to motivate the country to actually do it. So here's where I see, as an advocate for young people, I see this as terrifying, in that in 1904 we couldn't pass a law for the well-being of our children, but in 1938 we could pass a law for the well-being of our economy. Right? So we finally pulled young people out of the workforce for the sake of the economy. We couldn't do it for the sake of our children, and I think we have to own that, unfortunately. So the Great Depression, the culture, the idea of moratorium, these cultural anxieties that were present at the time, the depression, the removal of young people from the workforce, all of these things just become a wedge that gets driven deeper and deeper between young people and adults. And then lastly, the high school. So in 1930, less than half of teenagers were in high school, and by 1940, more than 2/3 were in high school. So in that decade, the American high school became the norm. Prior to 1930, it wasn't normal for young people to be in high school. So now they're pulled out of the workforce, and what are they going to do all day? Run the streets? No, we can't have that happen. Be entrepreneurial? No, we can't have that happen. Let's put them in school. And the way we thought about schools when we created our public schools was shaped by the way we thought about how we made cars, right? Put some parts in here, right? We all know engineering now. You put some parts in here, and they all come out the same on the other end. And that's how we thought about the education system when we built it around this time. And now we have massive schools that were built based on this framework, and we can't service children as well as we could with even different architecture. But we've invested in an infrastructure that was based on a misunderstanding of people, and now we're stuck with it. And these four things, the moratorium, cultural anxieties, Great Depression, and the high school become the petri dish that grows youth culture. Right? This is what allowed youth culture to grow. This is what allowed the adolescent or the undeveloped consumer to grow. And once we created this unique thing called the adolescent, then marketing people just jumped on it, right? And I should have brought them. I didn't. I have some of my mom's old American Girl magazines or 17 or any of those magazines. You flip through them. There's one I love to read my students. I open it up and I say, let me read this, the title of this article to you. And the title just says, "Some Like It Hot." And I ask my students, what do you think this article's about? Some like it hot. And they're like, oh, sex? I'm like, nope, sandwiches. It says what your boyfriend wants after school is a hot sandwich. And it has recipes for hot sandwiches so all the teenage girls can make hot sandwiches for their boyfriends after school, right? So the marketers, marketing people just jumped on this, right? A new niche market. And post-World War II, the economy was booming, and our young people were actually getting to work part-time jobs, and they had disposable income that they could spend, and they weren't around adults as much anymore. They had cars, Elvis Presley, right? And it was just this whole boom of youth culture that came at that time. And now for the first time in the United States, youth culture was different than adult culture. And that's just been amped up on steroids since then, really. To the point now where we have this thing called the adolescent. That's where it comes from, the undeveloped consumer. So rather than, and I think I'm just gonna do this and then stop. And if you want to get deeper into these things, you can read the book. Or maybe, and here's another idea. The book has discussion questions at the end of each chapter, so maybe some of you can read it as a group. Rather than thinking about our young people as undeveloped, as a Christian community, we get to think about them as called. That's the vocation piece, right? We get to think about them as called and equipped by God to do God's work right now in the world. And they'll do that work as a 12-year-old. They won't do that work as a 40-year-old when they're 12. But that doesn't mean they can't do it. I mean, they can do it perfectly as a 12-year-old, right? And when they're 40, they'll do it perfectly as a 40-year-old, wishing they were still a 12-year-old, right? So rather than thinking about them as undeveloped, we get to think about them as called. It's not that they haven't fully arrived, they've fully arrived. When they show up here, they're not an adult in waiting. I'm looking at the door as if one of them's walking in right now. They're not an adult in waiting. They're not a Christian in waiting. They're fully gifted and fully empowered now to change the world that they move through. And we get to help them trust that. We get to help them believe that. They're not identity-less. They're children of God. So we would say in baptism, you've been marked with the cross of Christ and sealed by the Holy Spirit forever. Become who you already are. Become who you are. In my conversation with Aaron, trust yourself. Become who you already are. God's already done the hard work of claiming you. You get to just believe that now. Not that that's easy, but we have a community here that's going to help you believe that. Rather than thinking about them as self-centered, egocentric, we get to think about them as highly relational. When they come in this room, they don't want us all staring at them. They don't know how to process that. But they do want you to come up and say, what's your name? What's your name, sir?
Myron.
They do want you to come up and say, my name's Myron, I haven't met you yet. You know, and then if Myron does that 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, then eventually Myron might get to say, hey, do you ever pray? Tell me how you pray, right? So it might not be calling everyone together to a prayer group. It might be you going up to the same kid week after week after week until all of a sudden now you feel like I can ask them the question I want to ask them.
And don't forget to smile.
And don't forget to smile. Exactly. Yeah. Rather than thinking about them as consumers, we get to think about them as co-creators. People called and gifted by God to work with God, empowered by God to do God's work in the world. See, I should have looked up the Bible verse, because now I'm going to say it and I don't remember where it's from again.
1 Corinthians 12:1.
You're kidding me!
I looked it up yesterday.
Awesome.
Pastors don't have it memorized?
I have the words memorized. That's all that matters. And I'm not a pastor,
That's
so
what I
that's
said,
probably.
but
If I was a
pastors
pastor,
don't
then
have
I'd probably have Bible verses memorized.
Yeah.
To each has been given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To each has been given a manifestation of the Spirit. We are not the Creator. We are co-creators. The Creator has given us a manifestation of the Creator's Spirit. For what? For the common good, right? To each has been given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. 1 Corinthians
I think it's 12:1.
12:1. See, if you wouldn't have said I think, we would have all been like, you just gotta.
Well, somebody just looked it up. I might have been proving wrong.
No, that's all right. It's in the Bible. You said you were Baptist, or you used to be, like, see, Baptists know their Bibles. Lutherans.
I've been just about everything except we
All right. So.
You can Google it.
I know.
Oh, we got our Bibles right here. Why don't you
What's
look it
helpful
up?
about that? Can I just say?
Yes, please.
It's interesting, you can pick that up at any moment, because one of the things that's built into all of this is the assumption of lifespans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you go out and you try to buy retirement stuff, they say, well, how long do you plan to live? And I say, well, I plan to live to 92. So my point is, a lot of this development process is also based upon what we think is going to happen in a lifespan.
Yeah.
All right, so if you've got 90 years, you're going to go through. What's beautiful about this side is that you don't have to even think of lifespan.
Yeah.
That can be, that's in the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some difference there,
Mm-hmm.
because we sometimes assume, I mean, it's this whole thing, you don't really become, you don't arrive till you get to a certain age.
Right.
This is saying you're fully arrived, you're fully present, you're fully engaged in the day-to-day, rather whether you're a child or an adult. But, because with Janet and I'm still waiting to become an adult.
I know.
Yeah.
It has to do with some of the assumptions that you're gonna live to the point that you finally arrive at adulthood when you're 95.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But that's a beautiful model.
And just quickly, something you said, Pastor, made me think of this. And you can read this in the book. You can read it in the book. In the New Testament, Jesus radically changes the way children are thought about, to the point where, so the Jewish community thought about children as important parts of the community and important parts of God's covenant. Greek philosophy thought about children as just part of the family, part of the family and the social structure intended to grow up to be workers or soldiers. And Jesus radically changed both of those and started talking about children not just as important members of the community and the covenant, but exemplars, examples of what God's kingdom looks like on earth. So very different. So you were saying they show up fully ready, like Jesus would say, Jesus would put the child right here and say, be like this one, right? So talk about fully arriving, like right here. This is what fully arriving looks like, this 7-year-old. Yeah.
The understanding of the youth culture at this point relative to the church is important. How does that relate to parents and grandparents' understanding of their children and grandchildren?
Well, I guess what the challenge for me as a parent is to think of my children this way. You know, and so how do I parent my children through this lens rather than through this lens? So when I find myself frustrated with my kids, I'm usually frustrated because I'm thinking about them in this way, right? And then my response to them comes out of my anxiety. Whereas if I can pause and teach myself how to think differently about my kids, then my response to them doesn't come out of anxiety, but comes out of compassion. So yeah, in the back.
Let me correct just a minute. 1 Corinthians 12:7.
There you go. I knew it was 1 Corinthians 12:7.
I was involved for 2 years in a program at Lorelei Lutheran Church in Maple Grove called Peer Ministry.
Yeah.
And this was 30 years ago. All the things that you have brought to us is what I experienced 30 years ago with the kids in classes. It's a volunteer program. It was a volunteer program, and 20 kids in the class. And I didn't come to preach. I came to help teach and guide students. But first, it was a matter of trusting. And it was amazing to see the kids come out of a lot of things. Talk about the breakup of their parents, for example, which was not as common in my day back at that age level, and how they ministered to one another. But they became all of these things on their own, only I was there just to guide.
Yeah.
And what was so much fun was the fact that I started by saying, okay, once a month somebody's going to have a birthday, let's have a birthday party, so I bring pizza and we do that. Because the kids are coming right from school to be in the class, and the classes were 2 hours in length.
Yeah.
I would come home, and I can verify this, just 10 feet tall. Again, another wonderful experience.
Yeah.
And what you come away from is you don't look at kids and say, oh, they're just kids. No, they have a lot to offer, and they know more than what we give them credit for.
Yeah, and their desire to accompany one another and befriend one another and support and challenge one another is just below the surface sometimes. And for whatever reason, they need some help, as we all do, kind of cracking open that shell or pulling the layers back, right? So peer ministry is a beautiful example of equipping young people to do this, for sure.
We just heard that word for the first time today, I think, trust, and that is really the bottom line. Trust. You have to build up trust.
And if you learn how to notice these tendencies in your own way of thinking about young people, and you can check those and learn these tendencies instead, then you will find yourself trusting them more. And if you trust them more, they will most likely trust you more as well. So, thank you all very much.